Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning into the Federalist Files. I greatly appreciate it. A couple of housekeeping things. This will be, Federalist number 56 we're doing today. So, Federalist number 56. And next week, I will not be doing any Federalist paper episodes. I will still continue to do the Tuesday into Wednesday current event episode, as well as the weekend special next week. But there will be no Federalist paper episodes because I have some family stuff that I'll be handling this week. It's all good stuff, no problems, but I won't be doing those. So I'll be doing this upcoming week. It'll just be current event episodes. Then obviously I'll start back up as well. Just a reminder, Mondays and Fridays are the Federalist paper shows. They usually release around 5 o'clock on podcast, 6 o'clock on Rumble and YouTube. And just leave me a message in the inbox or on the comments if you like this style more. I decided to shut the lights off because I'm trying to figure out the lighting situation here. Every single time I turn a light on, it reflects off of the camera and there's a horrible glare, and I don't really know how to figure it out exactly in the setup in my studio here. So I greatly appreciate you all for tuning in. We're going to get right into it. Federalist number 56, it is titled The Same Subject Continued, the Total Number of the House of Representatives. So this goes off of the last paper. It is written by James Madison, February 16th, 1788. Topics include state laws will be utilized as information for representatives, proportion of representatives to citizens. So this one in general is a very, very short paper, so it's not going to be a heavy lift today. It generally goes over how the federal representatives the knowledge that they are to acquire for their individual states, and how them meeting with other state representatives will help them to acquire this knowledge. And then it goes over very briefly about the apportionment in the House of Commons in Britain, their parliamentary system that they had at this time. So he starts off. The second charge from the last paper is that the House of Representatives, and I quote, will be too small to possess a due knowledge of the interest of its constituents. Madison contends, although this principle has foundation, the most important objects of knowledge to attain are those of commerce, taxation, and the militia. So he starts off this paper, he states, and I quote, "It is a sound and important principle that the representative ought to be acquainted with interests and circumstances of his constituents. But this principle can extend no further than to those circumstances and interests to which the authority and care of the representative relate, and ignorance of a variety of minute and particular objects which do not lie within the compass of legislation is consistent with every attribute necessary to a due performance of the legislative trust. In determining the extent of information required in the exercise of particular authority, recourse then must be had to the objects within the purview of that authority." End quote. So here what he's mentioning, the constituents need to have, or rather the representatives need to have their constituents' best. They have to represent their constituents the best way. And to do so, they have to have a knowledge of what they go through every single day. They have to be of the people. They have to be representative of the people. And this is something that commonly is lost now in today's society, in today's governmental structure. If you notice, a lot of our representatives are just rich dudes, rich women. They're people that take advantage of their position. They use their position to invest in stocks, knowing pretty much insider trading information, and they're not held liable for it because there's really nothing in the doctrine, in the code, that does not allow them to do so. They can go tell their family members, so they can throw money at their family members, give them insider trader information, and then they get a percentage of whatever it is that is earned through that capital gain. And that commonly goes on in politics. And there's also lobbying as well, where they take money into their campaign and then they'll draw money from their campaign and they'll find a way to launder it through some sort of consulting agency. So you've seen this with Ilhan Omar did this with her current husband. Maxine Waters did this with her daughter. So many people do this. Republicans, I'm sure, do the same thing. What's her name? What's that? I can't remember her name now, but the Georgia senator, she lost to that Purdue guy, or Warnock. She lost, I think, Warnock. and Purdue was the one that lost to Ossoff, the crazy socialist liberal. But I'm trying to think of what Kelly Loeffler, I think her name was, but she got caught in insider trading when COVID, right before the COVID news was released. She dumped a bunch of her stocks, and she's another one. She was a person that had a lot of money, a lot of which I don't knock people for doing well and being successful in business, but it just always seems like these like really sleazy people that are doing sleazy deals that are in our government. So he continues here. He states, and I quote, "What are to be the objects of federal legislation? Those which are of most importance and which seem most to require local knowledge are commerce, taxation, and the militia. A proper regulation of commerce requires much information, as has been elsewhere remarked. But as far as the information relates to the laws and local situation of each individual state, a very few representatives would be very sufficient vehicles to the federal councils." End quote. So we're saying the federal councils, you're going to need people that are aware of the information as it relates to local law, the local situation of each individual state. So if you have a guy that is in Missouri and he's a representative there, and the guy in New Jersey, the guy that lives in Missouri and is a representative, is going to have no clue of any of the local laws and jurisdiction in New Jersey, which makes sense. And there's a remedy for this. He's gonna state it. He states next, and I quote, "Divide the largest state into 10 or 12 districts, and it will be found that there will be no peculiar local interests in either, which will not be within the knowledge of the representative of the district. But besides this source of information, the laws of the state, framed by representatives from every part of it, will be almost of themselves a sufficient guide. In every state there have been made and must continue to be made regulations on this subject, which will in many cases leave little more to be done by the federal legislature than to review the different laws and reduce them in one general act." End quote. So they're saying in order to acquire the knowledge for the representatives in the individual states, they really just need to look at the state code, the state law, which is already there. It's been created at this point. So that's not going to really be that difficult. The key is to consolidate them into one general act, and that's really not of the federal jurisdiction anyway. So you want to understand your local laws in terms of showing up to Capitol Hill and being able to debate and understand what your constituents want. That's the point of you knowing those laws. But those laws really aren't under your jurisdiction unless if they do not concur with federal law, with the Constitution itself. So in terms of taxation, Madison cites, "It will consist of duties involved with the regulation of commerce. The laws of the state shall be the best resource of information in this regard, considering the states will already have these set laws. It will be a feasible job of the federal legislature to consolidate them into one general act." So that's just a simplified version of what I just said. So next he goes on, he states, and I quote, "To be fully sensible of the facility which will be given to this branch of federal legislation by the assistance of the state codes, we need only suppose for a moment that this or any other state were divided into a number of parts, each having and exercising within itself a power of local legislation. Is it not evident that a degree of local information and preparatory labor would be found in the several volumes of their proceedings, which would very much shorten the labors of the general legislation and render a much smaller number of members sufficient for it?" End quote. So what he's saying is, you're going to have these state codes. The federal legislation is going to be made based off of state codes in a general sense, as long as it, once again, it does not violate the Constitution. And having local legislation, having these local officers and these local politicians, local politics, will help to remedy this, help to make it much more feasible. So he goes on next. He states, and I quote, "The federal councils will derive great advantage from another circumstance. The representatives of each state will not only bring with them a considerable knowledge of its laws and a local knowledge of their respective districts, but will probably in all cases have been members and may even at the very time be members of the state legislature, where all the local information and interests of the state are assembled, and from whence they may easily be conveyed by a very few hands into the legislature of the United States." End quote. So what he's saying with this one is, you have people that are going to be working in the federal legislature, House of Representatives, and at one time they probably, because usually the way that politics works in a general sense is kind of a hierarchy. You start up in the state. Well, actually, not even in the state long. You may start up in the town. Then you start up in the county politics. Then from the county, you move up to the state. And then from the state, you move up to federal. That's traditionally how it usually works. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, that didn't happen. It really just depends on your power, your political power, how good you are as a politician, how well you understand the issues. Those all play in to the fact of whether you start at the bottom and you work your way up. But what he's trying to state here is you have people that are going to be working as federal representatives that have probably already represented the state itself, which is a true statement. So they kind of have an idea of what the state local laws are. So they represent their state very adequately. I don't know necessarily if this goes on now in current politics, which might actually be a problem. We've gotten very far away from the local political atmosphere. We've gotten closer and closer to a federalization of everything, a centralized power, centralized medicine, centralized healthcare, centralized law enforcement laws. We're going further and further for a push towards gun control. Everything is coming from the federal head, the HUD, Homes and Urban Development. They're attempting to change voting laws federally, which is completely in violation of the Constitution. And we're also looking to change districts in the way. That's another thing. They want to change districts federally too. And if you don't abide by the rules, then you don't get the same funding as the other states do. But the other one that the HUD situation, they want to change the local and town ordinances federally. So you have the guys in Washington making decisions. If you live in let's say you live in a small town in Missouri, you have them making decisions for your local jurisdiction, and your ordinances telling you, oh, well, you have to have at least 2 or 3 high-rise, low, district, what do they call it, Section 8 housing in your area because we said so as the federal government. And now you're going to get hit with the hard taxes from over there as well. You're going to pay for this Section 8 housing. So that being said, the federal councils will find a great advantage from another consideration. Representatives of the states may also have been longtime citizens as well as state legislatures at one time. They will possess extensive knowledge on local information and interests of the state. This will facilitate the conveyance of this information into the legislature of the United States. So he goes on. He states next, and I quote, "This information, so far as it may relate to local objects, is rendered necessary and difficult, not by a difference of laws and local circumstances within a single state, but of those among different states. Taking each state by itself, its laws are the same, and its interests but little diversified. A few men, therefore, will possess all the knowledge requisite for a proper representation of them." End quote. So he's talking about the local objects in a general sense. The state itself will have its own uniform law. So local objects may be a little different from town to town, from county to county, but in a general sense, mostly the state itself will have very generic general laws in terms of trade and commerce. So it won't be that difficult to translate that over. Next, Madison adds that representatives, in terms of learning their own state's laws and codes, will not be a difficult or strenuous task. States will have uniformity with the laws throughout the state. The issue will be gaining the knowledge of other states, and that's just what I stated. Simpler form. I always keep a simpler form. If I don't give a good explanation, then I kind of have something written down to give you as well to kind of do the old double tap. So next he asserts, and I quote, "Were the interests and affairs of each individual state perfectly simple and uniform, a knowledge of them in one part would involve a knowledge of them in every other, and the whole state might be competently represented by a single member taken from any part of it. On a comparison of the different states together, we find a great dissimilarity in their laws, and in many other circumstances connected with the objects of federal legislation, with all of which the federal representatives ought to have some acquaintance, whilst a few representatives, therefore, from each state may bring with them a due knowledge of their own state. Every representative will have much information to acquire concerning all the other states." End quote. So he says one representative from a state, because a lot of the state laws are so uniform, may be able to competently represent their state alone and be able to inform everybody and educate everybody on what the laws are in their specific state. But there's a great similarity of laws in individual states from state to state. Every representative will have to show up and listen to some of their colleagues and try to understand the state. If I'm a New Jersey representative and I show up and I have some colleagues that are from Michigan, I'm going to have to sit there and try to listen to and try to understand the laws themselves in Michigan, and that's the point of us having these assemblies, to better understand and comprehend other states and where their laws work. That's going to be the most difficult part, essentially, of the House of Representatives. So he goes on. Next, he states, at present... does he? Okay, so additionally, next. Madison, he foreshadows that some states may be much more advanced in terms of industry, which is also the reason for the provision of increasing representatives with the population. This is interesting. So he states next, and I quote, at present, some of these states are little more than a society of husbandmen. Few of them have made much progress in those branches of industry which give a variety and complexity to the affairs of a nation. These, however, will in all of them be the fruits of a more advanced population, and will require on the part of each state a fuller representation. The foresight of the convention has accordingly taken care that the progress of population may be accompanied with a proper increase of the representative branch of the government. End quote. So he's saying you're going to have some more industrialized states that are further along and further ahead, and further in the progress, I guess, in terms of their adaptation, making things easier for the people, innovation. So New York at this time had a lot of people. Philly had a lot of people. So Pennsylvania had a higher population, probably, if I had to guess, than Georgia. Even though Georgia was huge, there probably wasn't that many people down there at that time. So Pennsylvania and New York, this is the reason for the apportionment of people and representatives, which makes sense because you want every single person to kind of be somewhat counted equally, and that's the point of it. Madison once again uses the Congress of Great Britain as an example. Their population is 8 million and their representation amounts to 558. This is very interesting. So he states, and I quote, of this number, 1/9 are elected by 364 persons, and 1/2 by 5,723 persons. End quote. So you have 8 million people in Great Britain. Their representatives amount to 558, okay? 1/9 of them alone, 1/9 of 558, are elected by 364 people alone. So those 364 people have way more power than the other 8 million, okay? And then 1/2 of these representatives, 1/2 of this 558 people, are elected alone by 5,723 persons. So these ratios are completely off. You have some people that live in Great Britain that themselves, as a single voter, have way more power than other voters. That's the point that he's making. So Madison, he characterizes this source of representation as, in fact, not representative of the people at large. So he goes on to explain this and rip Britain. He states, and I quote, it cannot be supposed that the half thus elected and who do not even reside among the people at large can add anything either to the security of the people against the government or to the knowledge of their circumstances and interests in the legislative councils. On the contrary, it is notorious that they are more frequently the representatives and instruments of the executive magistrate than the guardians and advocates of the popular rights. They might therefore with great propriety be considered as something more than a mere deduction from the real representatives of the nation, end quote. So he's saying, because since these people are really, if you look at 1/9, and then you have a half of them, so that makes it out to be almost 5/9 of their representatives of their parliament, of their Congress, their form of Congress. 5/9 of it is elected by the numbers like, let me see if I can put this in better terms here, by about 6,000 people. So you have 6,000 people amongst 8 million that elect more than half of the Congress there. You have this very small amount, this very small politically connected population that really controls everything, that controls the power in the legislature amongst 8 million other people that are in existence there. So he goes on. Madison concludes that in Great Britain, the remaining 279 representatives are actually representative of the people in proportionality, one representative for every 28,670 constituents. So in the system of the United States, the proposed constitution at that time is one for every 30,000. In the case of Great Britain, is one for every 28,000. So that's kind of relative there. The real problem with this is that you had the representatives in Great Britain, the parliament. They were representative of this aristocrat-like system of these rich, politically connected people. And they were not really representative of the mass of people, the people at large themselves, the 8 million. So he ends here. He states, and I quote, "Yet it is very certain not only that a valuable portion of freedom has been preserved under all these circumstances, but that the defects of the British Code are chargeable in a very small proportion on the ignorance of the legislature concerning the circumstances of the people, allowing to this case the weight which is due to it, and comparing it with that of the House of Representatives as above explained, it seems to give the fullest assurance that a representative for every 30,000 inhabitants will render the latter both a safe and competent guardian of the interests which will be confided to it." End quote. So he's saying despite everything, all these problems that the British Parliament has in terms of their apportionment, it's not equally weighted out. And they still have a somewhat valuable portion of freedom, considering all of their failings in this sector. He's saying the United States, with their one per every 30,000, will be very competent. It will be adequate because at least it's fair. It's fair across the board. Everybody should have the same representation in this case. So that'll conclude this one. It was a very short one, folks. Make sure you tune into the weekend special. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in, as always. I really do. I'm very grateful. I got a really nice message from one of my listeners. I'm not gonna say his name because I don't want to be attacked or anything. Because who knows if who's watching, who's listening. This guy from Arizona. Just a very nice message. I greatly appreciate you for that. I am very, very grateful. I don't know how to really express people that listen. I'm grateful that it's gotten this far. I'm grateful that people tune in, listen to what I have to say, because what I say must resonate. People must agree. It's essentially the voice of the listeners, the voice of the viewers, really. So I thank you all for tuning in. Please tune into the weekend special. Tune into the current event podcast. Just a reminder: next week I will not have a Federalist paper. But I will still be I won't have the Federalist Paper podcast on Monday and Friday, but I'll still be doing the current event podcast on Wednesday. It's usually Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, and then a weekend special as well, as always. So thank you, and I will see you all this weekend.